Tunisia, March 23, 1943, 0530 hours. A low ridge called El Kadab, above a dusty valley road that runs southeast toward the town of Gabez. A first lieutenant of the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion, named Robert Luthi, lies flat against the forward slope, watching the grey light come up over the desert. Below him, strung along the valley floor, sit the thin, open fighting compartments of his platoon's vehicles. They are not real tanks. They are M3 gun motor carriages, a field gun bolted onto a half-track, with armor thin enough that the men who crew them have already invented a grim nickname for the things. They call them Purple Heart boxes. Luthi has been awake most of the night. His men have been awake most of the night, and out in the flat ground in front of him, in the half-dark, something is moving. At first it is only sound, engines, the specific grinding clatter of tracks on stone that every soldier in North Africa has learned to fear. Then shapes, many shapes, coming out of a fold in the ground about 1,000 yards away, spreading into the open in a formation so wide and so deliberate that it does not look like a raid or a probe. It looks like a parade. It looks like the whole weight of a German Panzer division rolling straight up the valley toward him. Luthi does the one thing his training tells him to do. He waits. He lets the range close. He lets the shapes harden into vehicles he can count. Later he would describe the moment in flat, simple words. He saw many men coming over a ridge, he said, and he waited until they were 1,000 yards from his position, and then he ordered all guns to fire. That short sentence is the beginning of one of the most important mornings in the history of the American Army, and almost nothing about how it actually unfolded matches the way most people think it did. Here is the strange part. The part that does not fit the way this war is supposed to go in the spring of 1943. The men in those German tanks are the professionals. They are the winners. 6 weeks earlier, at a place called Kasserine Pass, a German armored force tore the American army to pieces so completely that senior British officers openly wondered whether the Americans would ever be any use in this war at all. The soldiers rolling toward Luthi are veterans of exactly that kind of victory. They belong to the 10th Panzer Division, one of the most experienced armored formations in the German army. They have every reason to expect this morning to go the way every other morning against the Americans has gone, and in a few hours, dozens of their tanks will be burning wrecks in that valley, and the 10th Panzer Division will pull back having accomplished nothing. Not because the Germans blundered, not because their crews were cowards or their tanks were bad. They were neither, but because they drove into something they could not see and did not understand, something the Americans had built quietly, over 15 years, on a threadbare budget, in a country that did not want an army, something that had almost nothing to do with the tanks the Germans were watching for, and almost everything to do with a question a handful of obscure officers had been asking since the 1920s. This is the story of what the German panzers ran into at El Guettar, and to understand why it broke them, you have to understand that the trap was not really on that ridge at all. It had been set, in a sense, years before, on the dusty ranges of an artillery school in Oklahoma that most of the American army had never heard of and did not care about. So let us take it apart carefully, the way you would take apart a machine to see why it worked. Because the thing waiting in that valley was a machine, and the men in the tanks were about to be fed into it. Before any of that, though, you have to feel how badly the Americans had already lost. Because El Guettar does not mean anything without Kasserine, and Kasserine is not just a defeat. It is the reason the men on that ridge did not believe they could win. In the winter of 1943, the United States Army in North Africa was green. Not untrained exactly, but untested against a first-class enemy, and led in its southern sector by a corps commander named Lloyd Fredendall, who has become one of the more infamous figures in American military history. Fredendall commanded the American Second Corps, and he commanded it from a bunker complex dug into a ravine somewhere between 70 and 100 miles behind the front line. Engineers spent days blasting the shelters out of solid rock, while soldiers at the front went short of tools and mines. Fredendall rarely visited his forward units. He scattered his forces in small, isolated packets across the Tunisian hills, where they could not see one another, could not support one another, and in some cases did not even know who was on their flanks. He invented his own private code words for map locations that his subordinates could barely follow. One of his own senior generals, Ernest Harman, later called him, without hedging, a physical and moral coward. In the middle of February, the Germans hit this arrangement like a hammer hitting a plate. The blow fell around Kasserine Pass, and it was delivered by exactly the kind of concentrated, aggressive armored thrust the German army had spent 3 years perfecting. German tanks came through the passes faster than the scattered American units could react. Crews who had never seen combat found themselves facing the long guns of German armor at ranges where their own shells simply bounced. Positions were overrun before help could reach them. The results were catastrophic. In the span of about a week, American forces suffered somewhere close to 6,000 casualties. They lost, by the count kept afterward, 183 tanks, more than 100 half-tracks, over 200 artillery pieces, and hundreds of trucks and jeeps. Whole units simply came apart. Some 3,000 men were taken prisoner and marched into captivity. The army needed 7,000 replacements just to fill the holes that 1 week had punched in it. The damage that mattered most, though, was not counted in vehicles. It was counted in confidence. The British had doubted from the start whether the Americans could fight a first-class enemy. Kasserine seemed to prove them right, and some British officers said so openly, in words that got back to the Americans and stung. Worse, the Americans began to doubt themselves. Even ordinary soldiers began to wonder whether the German was simply a better kind of soldier, something close to superhuman, a professional against whom green amateurs from Ohio and Texas and Pennsylvania had no real chance. One American writer covering the campaign noticed the men around him wondering whether the enemy was not, somehow, a little more than human. That feeling, that quiet dread, is the thing you have to hold in your mind for the rest of this story, because 6 weeks later, it had not gone away. It was still there in the pits and foxholes when the 10th Panzer Division came up that valley at El Guettar. The Americans on that ridge were not men who expected to win. They were men who had been told by recent and bloody experience that they were going to lose, and some of them, it must be said, had personal reasons to expect the worst. The 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion, Luthy's own outfit, had been in Tunisia during the bad weeks. It had known the specific humiliation of running from German armor it could not stop, at places with names like Speitler and the Oseltia Valley. These were men who had already looked at advancing panzers and been ordered, or forced, to fall back. Their commander knew it, and he knew what it did to a unit's soul. Something had to change, and the first thing that changed was the man in charge. The senior American command relieved Fredendall and reached for the most aggressive fighting general they had. On March 6, 1943, Lieutenant General George Patton took command of the American Second Corps. Patton was a cavalryman by temperament and a showman by design, and he understood something important about a beaten army. An army which has lost its nerve has to be shocked back into believing in itself, and it will not happen by gentle encouragement. He did it with discipline that many of his soldiers found absurd and infuriating. Neckties in the desert heat, helmets worn at all times, even by cooks and clerks, steep fines for an unshaved face or an unbuttoned collar, enforced without mercy on privates and colonels alike. The men grumbled bitterly and cursed his name, but the point was never the neckties. The point was to make each soldier feel, in 100 small daily ways, that he now belonged to an organization that had standards, that noticed him, and that expected to win. Alongside Patton came Omar Bradley, quieter, more analytical, a very different kind of officer, who would serve first as the senior command's eyes, and then as Patton's deputy. Now, the plan. This is where popular memory tends to get El Guettar wrong, so it is worth being precise. Patton's corps was not sent to Tunisia to win the war by itself, and it was not turned loose to go hunting German armor. It was cast in a supporting role, and kept there on a deliberately short leash. The overall Allied ground commander in the theatre, the British General Harold Alexander, did not yet fully trust the Americans after Kasserine, and he planned accordingly. The main event was happening far to the southeast, where the British 8th Army under Bernard Montgomery was preparing to smash through a fortified Axis position called the Mareth Line. The job of Patton's 2nd Corps was smaller but real. Punch eastward out of the mountains, seize the town of Gafsa and turn it into a supply base, push on toward El Guettar and the road to Gabez on the coast, and by threatening that road, threaten the flank and the rear of the Axis forces facing Montgomery. The goal was to make the enemy nervous, to draw off his precious reserves and above all his armor, forcing him to spend it reacting to the Americans instead of concentrating it against the British. Patton compared his own role to Stonewall Jackson at the Second Battle of Manassas, a flanking effort meant to unhinge a much larger fight. It was, in the language of soldiers, an economy of force mission. Make a lot of noise, pin the enemy, bleed him if he comes at you, but do not overreach. The advance began, and at first it went almost too easily. On March 17th, the 1st Infantry Division, the famous Big Red One, under Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen, took Gafsa. Allen was a hard-drinking, hard-driving officer, beloved by his men and regarded with some suspicion by his superiors, precisely because his division was loyal to him rather than to the book. The Italian division holding Gafsa had largely pulled out before he arrived. American engineers lifted something like 2,000 mines from the approach roads. Quiet, dangerous work that gets no songs written about it. The next day, a battalion of United States Army Rangers under William Darby occupied the town of El Guettar itself. The Italians fell back into the rugged hills that flank the pass to the southeast, and there, for a few days, the easy part ended. The fighting became a brutal business of climbing mountains in the dark and prying determined defenders off high ground, rock by rock. The Rangers did something during those days that deserves its own moment, because it tells you what this army could do when it was led well and knew the ground. On the night of March 20th, Darby's men moved through broken country the enemy believed impassable. They scaled a cliff face in the dark. They passed their ammunition and their heavier weapons up hand over hand, man to man, in silence. And near dawn they came down on an Italian position from an angle nobody had thought to defend, screaming and firing, and the defenders broke. The Rangers took a great many prisoners that morning, and over the whole operation around El Guettar, the haul of captured Italians ran well into the hundreds. It was the opposite of Kasserine in miniature. Here the Americans were the ones who appeared where they could not be, and struck before the enemy understood what was happening. By March 22nd, the 1st Infantry Division had wrestled control of the commanding ridges that framed the valley. This is the detail that matters more than any other in the days before the battle. The high ground, the observation, the ability to look down into the valley and see, all of it was now in American hands, and that word, see, is going to decide everything that follows. Hold on to it. Because up on those heights, an American intelligence officer was reading the signs and drawing a hard conclusion. Colonel Benjamin Dixon, the intelligence chief of 2nd Corps, a man his colleagues called Monk, studied the enemy's movements and the pressure the Americans were now putting on the road to the coast. And he predicted, correctly and in advance, that the Germans were not going to tolerate this. They would counterattack, with armor, and soon, and most likely right here at El Guettar. This cannot be stressed enough. The Americans were not surprised at El Guettar. They were warned. Dixon called the shot. And a warned defender who holds the high ground and has a full day to prepare is a completely different animal from the scattered, blindsided units that had been swallowed whole at Kasserine. Terry Allen and his staff used the time exactly the way you would want a good commander to use it. They looked at the ground, and they read it like a book, and the ground at El Guettar was telling them a very specific story about how any attack would have to come. To understand the trap, you have to see the valley the way they saw it. Picture it. The valley runs roughly northwest to southeast, with the Gabez Road running down its length like a seam. On one side stands the high ground the Americans now held, ridges and a hill the soldiers came to call by a crude nickname, ground from which observers could see for miles. On the other side, more hills and broken country, and down in the low center of the valley sits the feature that decides the whole battle, a chott. In that part of North Africa, A chott is a salt marsh, a dry lakebed of treacherous crusted salt and mud. It looks solid. It is not. A tank that drives onto it, breaks through the crust, and mires itself to the belly in muck, trapped and helpless in the open. Which means that any armored attack coming up that valley cannot simply spread out and roll wherever it likes. The marsh forbids the center. The high ground threatens the sides. The attack gets funneled, squeezed, pressed into the firmer and narrower strips of ground on either side of the road. The terrain itself chooses the enemy's path for him, and the Americans, sitting on the heights with a day to think, knew in advance roughly where that path had to run. So they went to work on it. This is the heart of the matter, and it is where the title of this whole story finally comes into focus. American engineers, the 1st Engineer Battalion of the Big Red One, went out and laid a belt of anti-tank mines, not scattered at random, but placed with intent, in a long curving band that reached from the edge of the salt marsh, across the road, and along a dry watercourse toward the base of the hills. It was positioned precisely where the terrain would herd the German armor. Then, behind that mine belt, on the ridges and the reverse slopes, the Americans laid out the rest of the machine. The tank destroyers of the 601st Battalion dug in low with their fields of fire, sweeping across the open valley floor. The infantry of the 1st Division on the heights and across the line. And above all of it, tying the whole thing together into a single instrument, the artillery. Battalion after battalion of field guns positioned behind the ridges, their forward observers perched up high with a clear view of the funnel, their fire already worked out on the very ground the Germans would have to cross. That word, worked out, or the soldiers' word for it, registered, is the quiet key to this entire battle. To register artillery means to fire ranging rounds in advance at chosen points on the map, to watch where they land, to correct until a shell falls exactly where you want it, and then to write down the precise settings that put it there. Once a point is registered, you never have to range onto it again. You already own the numbers. In the middle of a battle, a forward observer can see an enemy move into that spot, call it in with a few words, and steel is already on its way, arriving in far less time than it takes to describe the process. The Americans at Guettar had pre-registered the killing ground. They had, in the most literal sense, already ranged the very earth the Panzers were about to drive across. The tanks were rolling toward a place where the range had been measured, written down in a fire direction center behind the ridge, and was simply waiting to be used. This is what the German Panzers ran into at Guettar. Not a lucky ambush, not a fluke, a prepared and calculated trap, built out of 4 things working as one. Terrain that funneled the attack, mines that would stop it, guns that had already measured the ground, and observers who could see all of it happen. Now watch the trap close. The 10th Panzer Division had been released for this counterattack only 2 days before, pulled together for the specific purpose of driving the Americans back from the coast road. Its commander was a general named Fritz von Broich, a cavalry officer by background who had come over to armor and had taken command of the division only weeks earlier. Through the night of March 22nd into the 23rd, his force assembled in the low ground to the southeast. It was a serious body of troops, though it was not at full strength, worn as it was by the long Tunisian campaign. Roughly 6,000 men, around 50 serviceable tanks, a company of self-propelled anti-tank guns, an assault gun battery, motorcycle troops for reconnaissance, half-tracks packed with Panzer Grenadiers, the tank-riding infantry who were the real muscle of a Panzer division, and Italian infantry in support. It was, on paper, more than enough to handle a green American division, and von Broich had recent history on his side to prove it. There is a detail about that division's staff that history has not forgotten, because of what one of those officers would later become. The operations officer of the 10th Panzer Division in Tunisia, the man responsible for turning the commander's intent into orders, was a lieutenant colonel named Klaus von Stauffenberg. A little over a year later, Stauffenberg would carry a bomb into a conference room in an attempt to kill Adolf Hitler and would be shot for it. But in the spring of 1943, he was simply a gifted staff officer helping to run an attack. About 2 weeks after the battle, on April 7th, far to the south near Mezuna, His vehicle was caught in the open by strafing Allied fighter bombers, and he was terribly wounded, losing his left eye, his right hand, and 2 fingers of his left. The men planning the assault on that valley were not distant cartoon villains. They were among the most capable soldiers Germany had. That is exactly why what happened to them matters. In the small hours before the attack, the Americans got one more gift. A patrol from the Tank Destroyer Battalion's reconnaissance element captured a German motorcycle scout, and the prisoner, under questioning, gave up the timing of the assault. The defenders on the ridge now knew, more or less, when it was coming, and it came. At around 0600 hours, out of the morning haze, the German armor rolled into the open in a broad formation that American observers described as something like a hollow square, tanks and half-tracks and guns moving together up the valley in a mass. For the men of the 601st, watching those shapes emerge, this was the exact nightmare they had lived at Spaitler and Useltia, the sight of German armor advancing on them in strength. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Herschel Baker, understood precisely what his men were feeling, because he was feeling it too. And he made a decision that morning that a lesser commander might not have made. He told them they would not run this time. Whatever the odds, they would hold their positions and fight it out. There would be no repeat of the retreats. It was one thing to say. It was another to make men who had already been beaten by these same tanks sit in thin-skinned half-tracks and wait. And for a while, the German attack worked the way German attacks were supposed to work. The leading elements drove hard into the northwest side of the valley, up into the foothills, and they hit American positions before those positions could fully react. They came down on a field artillery battalion, the 32nd, and part of another, the 5th, and here the fighting turned into exactly the kind of thing gunners are never meant to face. Not distant fire, but German tanks and infantry right on top of the guns. The artillerymen fought hand-to-hand for their pieces, firing over open sights at armor a few hundred yards away, some of them dying next to their howitzers rather than abandoning them. The 32nd Field Artillery Battalion would later be honored for that stand. For a terrible moment, watching from anywhere in that valley, it must have looked like Kasserine all over again, like the American line was about to crack and come apart the way it always had, and the Panzers were about to pour through into the rear. Then the 10th Panzer Division reached the dry watercourse called the Kedab Wadi, and it reached the mines. The lead tanks began to strike the anti-tank belt the engineers had buried across their path. Tracks blew apart. Vehicles slewed sideways and stopped, disabled, throwing tracks and settling onto damaged running gear. Something like 8 of them were knocked out of the fight in that band of buried explosives alone, without a single shot fired at them. And here is the thing about a minefield in the middle of a moving attack. Its real power is not only the tanks it destroys, it is what it does to the tanks it does not destroy. The advance stalled at the belt. Crews buttoned up their hatches and began hunting left and right for a way through. The neat rolling formation lost its shape. It bunched, it slowed, it lost its momentum, and every vehicle in it stopped being a fast-moving target that was hard to hit, and became instead a nearly stationary one. Sitting in the open, in the funnel, on ground the Americans had already measured to the yard and written down. That was the moment the machine closed on them. From the ridge, Lieutenant Luthie's tank destroyers opened fire, and all along the American line the other guns joined in. The 601st Battalion had been reinforced during the morning by another tank destroyer unit, the 899th, and this is a detail worth getting exactly right, because it is precisely the kind of thing that separates real history from the movie version, and getting it right is how you know you are being told the truth. The 2 battalions were not equipped the same way at all. The 601st was still fighting in those old M3 half-tracks, the Purple Heart boxes, a stopgap weapon that was really just a towed anti-tank gun mounted on a lightly armored truck. The 899th had something genuinely new. The M10, a purpose-built tank destroyer on a full-tracked chassis with a 3-inch gun in a rotating turret and sloped armor, a real tank killer that had only reached them a matter of weeks before. Together, the 2 battalions, the old and the new, worked from concealed and hull-down positions where only their guns and turrets showed. They went to work on the stalled German armor at ranges where even the thin-skinned half-tracks could bite into a tank's flank. It was not one-sided for the men who did it. The tank destroyer crews paid a hard price that morning. The 601st, sitting in their Purple Heart boxes and refusing to run this time, lost a heavy share of their vehicles, better than a third of the tank destroyers they had taken into the fight, along with many of their crews killed and wounded. Some platoons were shot to pieces, but they did not break, and that was the difference. One platoon leader, Lieutenant John Yowell, a Texan, fought his section down until he had only a handful of vehicles and a handful of men left, then took them back through rough hill country in the days that followed, chipping at rock to squeeze his surviving half-tracks through gaps barely wide enough, and brought them home. His comrades had written the whole platoon off as dead. When they turned up alive, men who had known them said they had never expected to see them again. That was the texture of the fight down on the valley floor. It was not a clean execution. It was a brawl that the Americans, for once, refused to lose. And over all of it, above the tank destroyers and the burning German armor, came the artillery. This is the part the Germans truly could not answer, and it is the reason for everything. The American observers on the high ground had the entire funnel laid out beneath them like a map, and the ground was pre-registered. As the Panzers bunched at the minefield and milled about looking for a way through, the forward observers called down fire that did not have to search for its targets, because the numbers were already known and waiting. Shells arrived in volume, and they arrived quickly, and they arrived again and again on the same measured ground. Brigadier General Clift Andrus, who commanded the 1st Division's artillery, watched one German battalion caught in the open try to run for cover from the fire. He described what he saw plainly, and it is worth hearing in something close to his own words. The battalion broke from cover, he said, and started to run for another dry wash in the rear, but none of them ever reached it. By around 9:30 in the morning, the first attack was finished. The 10th Panzer Division pulled back, towing what damaged tanks it could still recover toward a maintenance point in the rear, and leaving the rest of them burning and smoking on the valley floor. Think about what had just happened. In roughly 3.5 hours, an elite German armored division, veterans of victory, had attacked a green American infantry division, the same broad army it had shattered at Kasserine only 6 weeks before, and it had been stopped cold and thrown back with heavy loss. Something on the order of 30 tanks had been destroyed or disabled in that morning fight, between the mines, the tank destroyers, and the guns. The trap the Americans had built out of terrain and mines and registered fire had done exactly what it was designed to do. There was a lull, and it had its own quiet drama. The Americans on the ridge were running low on ammunition after the morning's fighting, and resupply meant driving trucks and jeeps across ground the Germans could still reach, with shell fire and the occasional dive bomber. Small parties ran that gauntlet through the day, and many of the vehicles that set out did not come back. Meanwhile, American intelligence, listening to German radio traffic, picked up the signs of a second attack being organized for the afternoon. The defenders had time to redistribute what ammunition they had, to reset, and to wait. The ground was still registered. Nothing about the fundamental trap had changed. The second attack came in the late afternoon, launched after 4:30 on a signal, and the Germans changed their method. This time they put their infantry forward, the Panzer Grenadiers advancing with the tanks, supporting from behind rather than leading. Perhaps they had learned that leading with armor into that valley was suicide. But infantry in the open against pre-registered American artillery was, if anything, worse. There was no minefield surprise needed this time, and no overrunning of gun positions. There was only the measured killing ground and the observers looking down on it from the heights. The American artillery caught the advancing infantry in the open and destroyed it methodically. An observer with the 18th Infantry sent a message that evening that has survived precisely because of its brutal, unforgettable clarity. Our artillery, he reported, crucified them with high explosive shells, and they were falling like flies. The second attack collapsed as completely as the first. By nightfall, the 10th Panzer Division had nothing to show for the entire day but wreckage and dead. And the next morning it could report only about half the running tanks it had started with. Watching that afternoon's slaughter from a forward position up on the high ground was a small group of senior American officers, and among them was Patton himself. Beside him stood Terry Allen, the division commander, and the assistant division commander, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., the son of the former president, a small, limping man who insisted on being where his soldiers were and who would win a Silver Star for his conduct that day. Earlier, when German tanks had threatened Allen's own command post and someone had suggested pulling it back to safety, Allen had refused in language nobody misunderstood. He said he would like hell pull out and that he would shoot the first man who did. Now, watching German infantry cut down in the open by that unanswerable pre-registered fire, Patton, of all people, said something quiet and revealing. "My God," he said, "it seems a crime to murder good infantry like that." It is a strange sentence to hear from a general who had built his entire reputation on the offensive spirit and the will to kill. But it captures something true about what happened at El Guettar. The killing that day was not really a duel between equals. It was a demonstration of a system so lopsided that even the great apostle of aggression found the sight of it hard to watch. So now we arrive at the real question. The question that separates a good battle story from an actual understanding of the war. Why did it work? Why did the same American army that came apart at Kasserine turn its attacker into burning wreckage 6 weeks later, on ground that was, after all, just another stretch of North African desert? It is tempting to give the easy answer. Patton fixed them. The neckties and the discipline and the sheer force of one man's personality turned frightened men into lions in a month and a half. That is the version the movies love, and there is a sliver of truth in it, because morale is real, and Patton really did help restore it. But it is not the answer. You cannot rebuild the fighting soul of a beaten corps in 6 weeks with a dress code, and the men on that ridge were not suddenly and magically braver than the men at Kasserine had been. In many cases they were quite literally the same men, in the same units, like the 601st. Something other than courage had changed the outcome, or rather, something other than courage had given their courage a chance to matter. The honest answer is that the thing which broke the 10th Panzer Division at El Guettar was not something Patton conjured up in March of 1943. It was something the United States Army had been building, slowly and almost invisibly, for 15 years before that morning in the valley, in a time when almost nobody was watching and almost nobody cared. And to see it clearly, you have to leave Tunisia entirely and travel back to a country that did not want an army at all. Through the 1920s and the 1930s, the United States Army was a marginal, neglected thing, small, poor, and largely ignored by the nation it served. By the end of the 1930s, it ranked around 17th in the world by size, which is to say, it was smaller than the army of Romania. It was starved of money all through the long years of the Depression, when the government cut nearly every kind of spending to the bone, and an army seemed like a luxury a broke country could not afford. It had little prestige and even less political support. A talented young officer could spend 10 or 15 years stuck at the same rank, watching his civilian friends build careers and fortunes, while he drilled a skeleton company at some dusty post. By every outward measure, this was not an institution that looked remotely capable of building a war-winning machine. But a poor army that cannot afford new tanks and new aircraft has, in certain quiet corners, a strange kind of freedom. It has nothing to do but think, and in a few specific pockets of that neglected army, a handful of serious officers spent the lean years thinking very hard about a single unglamorous problem. Not how to build a better tank, because there was no money for tanks. The problem they chose was this: how do you deliver artillery fire faster and in greater concentration than any other army on earth? They chose artillery for a very practical reason. Artillery, unlike tanks or aircraft, was something even a broke army already owned. The guns themselves were mostly left over from the previous war, sitting in depots, paid for long ago. What could be improved was not the guns. It was the brain that directed them. And a brain is cheap. A brain is just doctrine, and mathematics, and training, and radios. A poor army could afford to build a better brain even when it could not afford anything else. The place where this thinking happened most intensely was the Field Artillery School at Fort Sill in Oklahoma, and the men who did the thinking are almost completely unknown outside the narrow world of artillery history, which is one of the small injustices this story exists to correct. In the late 1920s and into the early 1930s, an officer named Carlos Brewer, who ran the gunnery department at the school, began tearing apart and rebuilding the fundamental methods by which American artillery was aimed, controlled, and concentrated. His successors carried the work further, refining it year by year. One of them, Orlando Ward, helped drive the idea that would eventually change the character of American firepower for the rest of the century. They gave it a plain, bureaucratic name: the Fire Direction Center. To understand why that dull-sounding phrase mattered so much, you have to understand how artillery worked nearly everywhere else in the world at that time. A battery of guns was its own little independent kingdom. It found its own targets, made its own calculations, and fired its own missions more or less on its own authority. To bring the fire of many separate batteries down onto one single target at one time was possible, but it was a slow, clumsy, elaborate affair. It had to be planned in advance, coordinated by senior officers, and arranged like a formal event. It was absolutely not something you could improvise in a few minutes in reaction to a threat that had suddenly appeared out of nowhere. The Fire Direction Center broke that limitation completely. It took the brain out of each individual battery and centralized it. Instead of each battery working alone, a single control center behind the line would receive a target from a single observer, compute the firing solution for every gun within range at once, and bring them all down together on that one point. The revolutionary human consequence of this was almost hard to believe for the officers who first saw it. One man, one forward observer, lying on a ridge with a radio and a map, looking at the enemy with his own eyes, could call for and receive the massed, concentrated fire of many batteries, an entire battalion, and in time far more than that, landing on a single spot within minutes of his request. When Fort Sill first demonstrated the underlying techniques, much of the artillery world responded not with excitement, but with polite indifference, and sometimes with outright skepticism. The mathematics, however elegant, seemed to many career officers like a clever solution to a problem nobody had actually asked them to solve. The communications it demanded seemed impractical given the radios of the day. It struck a lot of experienced gunners as academic, unnecessary, a peacetime toy. Brewer and the men who thought as he did pressed on anyway, through the lean years, with little to show for it but paper and practice. But the American Army, quietly, without fanfare, in a way that drew almost no attention at home and none at all abroad, had built itself one of the most responsive and concentrated artillery systems in the world, and it had built that system in large part precisely because it had been too poor to build anything more glamorous. Poverty had forced it to get smart about the one thing it already had. This was the true thing waiting for the 10th Panzer Division at Guettar. Not really the Ridge, and not really the tank destroyers, formidable as they were. It was the method. When those observers on the high ground looked down and called fire onto German armor bunched helpless at the minefield, they were not improvising something desperate and new. They were executing a capability that had been designed, argued over, refined, and rehearsed for 15 years for exactly this kind of moment. A single observer, looking down at a funnel full of stalled tanks on ground that had already been ranged, could summon the concentrated weight of battalion after battalion and put it precisely where it would do the most harm, and he could do it faster than the Germans could possibly adapt to it. The pre-registration in the valley was simply this national capability made local. The homework had been done in Oklahoma years before. Guettar was only where the answer got written down in fire. And here is the deeper point, the one that reframes the entire battle and, in a sense, the whole war. The German army had spent those same 15 years building its excellence around an almost opposite idea of how battles are won. German military culture prized, above nearly everything, the initiative and judgment of the man on the spot. The local commander, even a fairly junior one, was trained and trusted to read a fluid situation with his own eyes and to act on it immediately and aggressively, without stopping to ask permission. It was a doctrine sometimes called mission command, and it was genuinely brilliant. It produced the fast, flexible, ferociously effective small unit leadership that the German army was famous for and that its enemies feared. It is precisely the quality that had won at Kasserine. The bold local thrust. The junior officer who sees a gap and pours through it before the enemy can even understand that a gap exists. The American system that beat them at Guettar was almost the reverse in spirit. It placed comparatively less faith in the individual brilliance of the man at the point of contact, and much more faith in the design of a system that would work well no matter who happened to be holding the radio that day. The real strength was not located in any one soldier's head or heart. It was baked into the procedure itself, engineered years in advance by officers whose names no monument records. Now, both of these approaches were coherent. Both were the product of serious professional thought. Both, it must be said clearly, produced excellent and brave soldiers. This is not a story about good soldiers beating bad ones, but only one of the two approaches meant that a lieutenant on a ridge, not a general at a headquarters, could reach out and pull down the massed fire of an entire artillery command onto a target in the instant it appeared. At Guettar, the German way of war and the American way of war met each other on a piece of ground that favored the American way almost completely. The funnel, the mines, the registered guns, the observers who could see. It was a battlefield that rewarded the patient, prepared, centralized system over the bold individual stroke, and the 10th Panzer Division drove straight into the seam between the two philosophies and was torn apart there. Now step back inside one of those German tanks for a moment, because the human core of this story lives in that hot, dark, buttoned-up space, and it is easy to lose it among the doctrine. The crews of the 10th Panzer Division were not fools, and they were not amateurs, and they were not cowards. They were among the finest armored soldiers in the world, and they carried into that valley the fresh and justified memory of having beaten this very enemy 6 weeks earlier. When they rolled up the valley in the dawn light, they were doing what good tank crews always do. They were watching, hard, for the things that kill tanks. Enemy armor on the ridgelines, the long barrels of anti-tank guns pointed at them from ahead, the muzzle flashes of a defending line they could shoot back at. They were fighting the battle they knew how to fight, and they were fighting it well. But the thing that was actually killing them did not announce itself in any of the ways their experience had taught them to expect. There was no line of enemy tanks out ahead to duel with, gun against gun, the kind of fight they might have won. The mines were silent and invisible, buried in the dirt, giving no warning at all until a track found one and disintegrated. And the artillery that did the great bulk of the actual killing, was fired from guns positioned far behind the ridge, guns the German crews never saw once, could not locate, and could not shoot back at no matter how brave or skilled they were. It was directed by a man who was, from inside a tank, nothing more than a tiny distant figure on a hilltop, if he was visible at all. From within the steel box, men were being killed by an enemy that seemed to be simultaneously nowhere and everywhere. The shells simply arrived, in volume, on target, correcting, again and again. Falling on ground the German crews had no earthly reason to believe was any different from the last 10 miles of ground they had crossed. They had driven into a place where the range was already known and written down, and they had no way of knowing it, and no way at all of answering it. That is why the aftermath of Guettar matters so much, because it is what keeps this from collapsing into a simple, comforting fairy tale of American triumph. What happened in that valley on March 23rd was a genuine and important defensive victory. It was, by any fair reckoning, the first battle of the war in which American ground forces broke a concerted attack by an experienced German Panzer division and threw it back in ruins. That is not a small thing. It rippled outward. It changed, permanently, how the American soldier saw himself, and just as importantly, it began to change how his skeptical British allies saw him. After the humiliation of Kasserine, that shift in belief was worth almost as much as the burning tanks themselves. But holding a ridge against an attacker is one kind of war. Pushing forward to take ground from a prepared defender is another kind entirely, and it is far harder, and at this the same American army found no magic waiting. In the days and the weeks that followed March 23rd, Patton's corps tried to press on down the valley toward the coast, to break through the hills, to drive on to Gabès and cut the Axis line of retreat. And here the story turns hard, and bloody, and grindingly inconclusive. The very same terrain that had funneled the German tanks so neatly into the American trap now funneled American attacks into Axis defenders, dug deep into the high ground. Assault after assault against the flanking hills and ridges through late March and into early April failed, and failed again, at painful and mounting cost. At one point an American rifle company was cut off, and overwhelmed, and forced to surrender. The Germans and Italians fed in reinforcements and held. The advance ground down into a stalemate that dragged on for the better part of 2 weeks, and when the breakthrough to the coast finally did come in early April, it came less because the Americans had smashed their way through the hills by main force than because the entire Axis position in southern Tunisia was by then collapsing under Montgomery's pressure elsewhere, and the enemy chose to pull back rather than be cut off. So the honest verdict on El Guettar is a divided one, and it should be given as one. On the defensive, on the morning and afternoon of March 23rd, in the funneled valley with the registered guns, the American war machine worked so smoothly and so lethally that the sight of it made George Patton, of all people, speak of murder. On the offensive, in the weeks afterward, in the broken hills, that same machine offered no such magic, and American infantry paid the ordinary, terrible, unglamorous price of attacking a dug-in enemy on bad ground. The victory was completely real. It was also strictly limited. Both of those statements are true at once, and popular memory has a way of keeping only the first of them and quietly forgetting the second. That popular memory, it has to be said plainly, owes a great deal to a single famous film. For an enormous number of people, everything they think they know about El Guettar comes from the movie about Patton, and that film, for all its craft and power, is not history, and it is worth saying exactly where it departs from the truth. The film compresses the fighting and rearranges it for drama. It stages the battle as a personal duel of wits, general against general, between Patton and the legendary German commander Erwin Rommel, and it gives Patton a magnificent line to the effect that he had read Rommel's book and therefore beaten him. It is a wonderful scene. It is also false at its very foundation. Rommel was not there. Rommel had left Africa for good on March 9th, 2 full weeks before the battle, a sick and exhausted man ordered home by his own high command. The 10th Panzer Division that attacked at El Guettar was commanded by Fritz von Broich, and overall Axis command in Tunisia had passed to General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim. The detail about the book is muddled as well, conflating and simplifying the real history of what Rommel had written and when it could be read in English. The film even puts the wrong aircraft in the sky and, in its battle scenes, tanks that did not exist until years after the war. None of this is said to attack the film, which did more than almost anything else to keep this battle alive in public memory. It is said only because, if you actually want the real El Guettar, you have to set the movie gently aside. The truth of what happened in that valley is stranger, and harder, and finally more interesting than a duel between 2 great men. Because it was not a duel between men at all. It was a collision between 2 entire philosophies of how to wage war. And that collision is the thing to carry away from all of this. Come back, one last time, to Lieutenant Luthi on the ridge in the grey light of dawn, watching those broad shapes spread out across the valley floor and harden into tanks. In a real sense, almost everything that was about to happen to the 10th Panzer Division had already been decided before he gave the order to fire. It had been decided by the salt marsh and the hills that would funnel the attack onto narrow ground. It had been decided by the engineers who had buried their minds in exactly the band of dirt the tanks would be forced to cross. It had been decided by the infantry and the tank destroyer crews who chose, this time, not to run. And most of all, it had been decided, years earlier and an ocean away, by a handful of unfamous officers at a poor artillery school in Oklahoma, whose patient work meant that the very earth of that valley had already been measured, its ranges recorded, its fire waiting on call. The German crews came up the valley watching for tanks and for guns, because in the war they understood and had mastered, you killed what you could see, and you died to whatever could see you. They were hunting for the enemy's line, but the decisive enemy at El Guettar was not a line at all, and that is the whole point. It was a method. It was the plain, almost invisible fact that a single American on a hilltop could look down at a column of stalled armor and, with a few words spoken into a radio, bring the crushing concentrated weight of an entire artillery command down onto ground that had been ranged before the sun came up. There was no line to break through. There was no single gun whose silencing would end the threat. There was no flank to turn. There was only a place where the range was already known, and the pitiless arithmetic that followed from that one fact. For years, the 10th Panzer Division and armies like it had perfected the bold stroke, the fast and violent thrust delivered by a brilliant commander reading the moment with his own eyes, and that art had carried German armor to victory after victory, including over these very Americans just 6 weeks before. At El Guettar, that art drove headlong into an army that had quietly reached a different conclusion about how the outcome of battles should be decided. An army that had decided, in its poverty and its obscurity, that victory should not rest on the brilliance of any single man on any single day, and had built instead a system that measured the ground in advance and delivered overwhelming fire onto it faster than any enemy could react. The German instinct was to find the opening and seize it before anyone could stop him. The American design was to make certain that wherever the enemy chose to go, the range was already recorded there, and the guns were already waiting. Both were real and serious ways to fight a war, and for a long time, on most ground and on most days, the German way had been winning. But in one funneled valley on the morning of March 23, 1943, on Earth the Americans had already ranged. The two ways of war met head-on, and only one of them had been built, over 15 patient years, for exactly that moment. The Panzers came looking for the kind of battle they knew how to win. What they ran into was a machine that had been waiting for them for a decade and a half, and they never once saw the shape of it, until it had already closed around them. If this account gave you a clearer picture of what really happened in that valley, and why it mattered so much more than the movie version suggests, consider subscribing, so the next deep look into the forgotten machinery behind the battles of this war can find its way to you. History like this deserves to be understood, and not just remembered as a scene from a film.